Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, Hook On. Main Peugeot dealers in the Premier County. And now stocking the full range of the luxury French car brand DS Automobiles. Book your test drive today with Slattery's Garage, Hook On. See slatterysgarage.ie.
Now, welcome back. Glad to be joined in the studio by John G. O'Dwyer as we continue with our story of Ireland. Good morning. Happy New Year to you, John.
Many happy returns indeed, Jen. I love the New Year's. Time of expectation.
Absolutely.
When anything is possible.
Absolutely. And then we discover that anything isn't possible as the years go on. But there you go. You're going to talk to us about the Normans today. We're kind of up to that period of time. In terms of what years we're talking about, will you date this for me now?
Well, if you're talking about the Normans, basically what they are firstly was the Norsemen. So they came with they were part of the Vikings, but they actually never really captured Ireland. But they settled in the north of France and they captured that. And they were very ambitious and they became very innovative, very good farmers, but very good fighters as well. They innovated in terms of fighting. They were the first people to wear armour. They fought on horseback. They had an innovation. If they were charging if they were facing an army of infantry, they would get on horseback. They would charge. And this was a terrifying thing coming at you. These armoured knights coming straight at you with lances. Most armies would have broken in terror. That's how they operated. They used longbows as well, which you could pick people off with at a distance. Came powerful in France and then eventually invaded England, William the Conqueror. So we're talking 1066. He invaded England. So they captured England in 1066.
From France?
From France. They were in the north of France.
And they were Christians?
Initially they weren't, because the Christianity was within the Roman Empire. So when the Vikings came first, they weren't Christians. But once they settled in France, they took the local culture and they took on board Christianity. So at this stage, they were Christian. In fact, at that stage, there was hardly any other religion in Europe. A few Jews around the place, almost nothing else but Christians in Europe.
So they invaded England. When did they put their spotlight on Ireland?
Well, then, that was it. I think they were so powerful and so land hungry, it was probably inevitable that sooner or later they would invade Ireland. But the trigger for this was, everybody thinks they were invited in by Dermot MacMurrough. They weren't actually invited in by Dermot MacMurrough the first time. We mentioned that the last day. We couldn't think of his name. Pope Adrian IV gave him a laudability. He wanted him to invade Ireland.
Why?
Because he didn't like the way the church was being run in Ireland. The canonical laws were not being met. They have their own kind of an independent, as Irish often do, they'd had an independent republic. But when you're looking at history, follow the money. That's what they always say. And they weren't paying their dues to Rome. He wanted to teach them a lesson. So he wanted Henry to invade, bring in the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and they would reform the Irish church. But Henry didn't do that straight away because he was busy with his own wars. He was fighting in Scotland. He was fighting in France. But then the second invitation came when Dermot MacMurrough was driven out of Ireland by the other kings. He was very aggressive towards them, still taking some of their territory, and he'd also made off with the wife of the King of Breffni, and that was seen as a terrible insult. So they came, and he was down in Ferns in Wexford. They kicked him out. He wouldn't take that lying down, so he headed off to see Henry. Where did he go to see Henry? Stay in London? No. These were, remember, basically French people. They still had their court down there. Henry actually spoke French, so he went to Anjou. Henry wasn't too interested in Ireland. He said, it's kind of a backwater. But look, I will kind of support you if you like. But look, I'm not going over there to fight it myself. If you can get the barons in Wales, my barons in Wales, support you, fine. So Dermot hot-footed it back to Wales. And there he met the likes of Robert Fitzstevens, Hugo Lacy, and more important of all, Strongbow, the Earl of Pembroke. And they supported him. They came into Ireland, landed in 1169 at Begginbone in Wexford, and because they were more experienced fighters, in a short time Dermot was back as the King of Leinster.
Now, and what did that mean for the country then? I mean, what influence did they have?
Well, they brought a very, very big influence. We are all hugely influenced by that. Whether it's good, the first thing they brought in with them was the English language. Yeah. That is the first thing they brought in. They brought in the common law as well as that. This kind of an idea, and they brought in feudalism, but the common law as well as that everybody is subject to the law, even the king. You know, that kind of, they brought in that with them as well. But then they were great innovators. So they brought things, you know, I'd spent some time at it, I know if you ever did, out making hay in a field and the pikes of hay and that, haymaking, where you could save food for animals over the winter and bring in the animals. That was a new innovation.
So they brought a lot to agriculture then.
They were great because France was so fertile.
Yeah.
Wheat into Ireland, barley into Ireland, and would you believe it or not, whether it's a good thing or not, rabbits into Ireland as well.
Did they? Indeed?
Yeah, they brought the rabbits in. Yes.
Wow.
Brought them in from France. Whether that's a good or a bad thing. But of course, they were a big food then. We don't tend to they were brought in as a food.
We're very familiar with their architecture, of course. Yeah. Will you tell us about that? What they brought by way of that? What they built?
Well, what they built, essentially, because you remember then, what they would have done is how they consolidated territory. So you'll remember when we were down in Kilsheelan. Remember the moat?
I do, of course.
That's a moat. That's built by the Normans. So initially, that's how they consolidated territory. They would have held high ground, they would have made it steeper if they could, and they would build a palisade around it so that they couldn't be attacked. And that was controlling the river crossing. Then they went on later on, as they became consolidated more, they began to build castles. And so they're the tower houses, the square castles we see around the country. And in the end then, of course, they became huge. We'll say the de Lacy's, they would have built Trim Castle, massive. And then, of course, the Butlers, Kilkenny Castle, Cahir Castle. These are much bigger than tower houses. They're absolutely huge. So they left a huge architecture in stone behind, which, of course, the Vikings who came before them didn't, because they built in wood.
It's interesting. And how did they sort of get into the culture then, or did they get into the Irish culture, or did they just sort of bring along their own and that superseded everything else?
Initially they brought along their own, but in the long run they went native. That was the thing about them. They went native. They started marrying into the Irish. In fact, the English hated that. And the statutes of Kilkenny were brought out, and they were to stop the Normans integrating with the Irish. They were to stop speaking the Irish language. They were to stop marrying into the Irish. They were to stop, would you believe, hurling. They weren't allowed to hurl. They weren't allowed to ride a horse bareback, because that's the way the Irish did it. And they were not allowed, the dancing and that. They were not allowed to perform those. Now, complete, absolute, that was the law. Nobody paid the slightest bit of attention to it, because back in England there was a lot. The kings in England were tied up. So if you're talking about the 1300s, they have wars with Robert Bruce in Scotland. Then they have the 100-year war, which went on for 120 years, and then you have the War of the Roses. Ireland is a backwater. Nobody cares much. They might talk about it. What the Normans are doing in Ireland, and what they're doing is they're integrating in with the Irish people. They're the people who are around. So suddenly, then the Lacys become Lacys. The Burgos become Burkes, the Fitzgeralds become Mockgarls. So they integrated into the Irish people, and that was the thing. And they became then what was known as the Old English. And then when the Reformation came along, they stayed Catholic, for the most part.
Interesting. Am I right in thinking was the Black Death around this time as well?
That would have a big effect on them as well. Yes, the Black Death would have, when that arrived in 1327, it killed lots of the Irish, but it had a disproportionate effect on the Normans because they lived in communities. And that's where it transmits, while the Irish were out on the hills. So it had a disproportionate effect on them.
So was that a game changer?
Yeah, that would have been a game changer, along with another thing. Would you believe what they had a problem with in those days? They had a problem with climate change. But the climate was actually getting colder. That was what was happening. So they were growing their corn, and the season was actually getting less. It was getting shorter for growing barley. So they were being forced out of the west of Ireland. They could, in the middle of Ireland, because they couldn't do arable farming anymore. Some of them left. They became poorer. They began to change over to cattle, which was the Irish way of doing things. So the climate change got to them as well as that. And then, of course, at that stage, they were heavily integrated into the Irish people, and London was a long way fighting their own wars.
Right. Did Henry VIII come into play then?
Well, he did at the very end of the Norman period. What happened then was the War of the Roses. There was, and everybody was concentrating on that. Lancaster and York, the two houses. Yeah. Lancaster won it. They were the Tudors. And Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, then, for the first time, you got a pretty stable monarchy there. And they were the Tudors, Henry VII. And then his son was Henry VIII. And he then was the one who who made huge changes. Even though Henry VIII initially, if you look at an English coin, you'll see Defender of the Faith. He was given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope because he wrote Lutheranism. You see, the time of Henry, early on in his time, that was the time of Martin Luther, the time he put up his 95 principles on the door of the cathedral in Germany. And Henry criticised that. But then, of course, what happened in the long run then was that he was married to Catherine of Aragon, and they couldn't produce a male heir, so Henry wanted to dispose of her. So normally that wouldn't be a problem. Now, as you know, I think up to this day, I think there's no divorce in the Catholic Church, but there is a kind of a backdoor thing of an annulment that the marriage never existed.
Yeah.
So normally a pope would say, Henry, we'll find a way out for you. But this time, what happened? The Pope was a prisoner of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was actually the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. He says, "No way, Your Holiness, are you giving a dispensation here. That would reflect very badly on my family." And that was the split. So you'd think Ireland, as a Catholic country, and England would stay Catholic and dodge the bullet. That one single decision meant that England went largely Protestant. Now, they didn't go Lutheran. They went in between. There's a kind of Anglicanism is a kind of a compromise religion between Lutheranism and what we would maybe call Presbyterianism here and Catholicism and they created a kind of their own religion. But the important thing to remember is that Henry himself changed very little. So if Henry was asked on his deathbed, "What religion are you?" he would have said, "I am Catholic, but I am the head of the Catholic Church."
It's very interesting. In terms of other people who made their way in and had an influence on Ireland, where would the Normans stand in terms of that hierarchy, if you know what I mean, John?
I'd say probably of all, they're definitely the biggest single single influence in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of innovation, the amount of changes they brought. And then, of course, the huge thing was they brought all the monastic orders came in with them as well, and they had a huge influence on the Irish Church. The old English Church then, old Irish Church, Celtic Church, that simply died away, and, Ireland became, funnily enough, for a country that for a long time didn't pay much attention to Rome, suddenly they became very dedicated to Rome. And when Henry tried, England, changed very, very rapidly to a Protestant country. Ireland refused to, even though it might have been easier for them to do that. They developed a huge loyalty to Rome then. And even though from the time of Henry on, the worst thing you could be accused of was popery. That was the worst possible thing you could be. But the Irish still held on at a huge cost to themselves. Now, it was more difficult anyway to evangelise the Irish for one simple reason. Most evangelisers were Protestant. They spoke English. Irish was still by far the dominant language. But again, you see, the language we are speaking now, that's a language that was brought in by the Normans.
And at this stage, how was the country run and policed?
It wasn't really, if you're talking about the Normans, it was, and we're going back again, it wasn't a rule-based order, it was might is right. So how it was done was, the Normans generally, they would be in the powerful lords, so the Butlers would have ruled over South Leinster, the Fitzgeralds over Kildare, the Southern Fitzgeralds over Munster.
Right. And all these places were autonomous in some way, were they?
Pretty autonomous for a long time, until Henry came along. And Henry then, when he became a bit powerful, didn't like that. So he came along with an idea of surrender and regrant, that they would actually surrender their holdings as whatever the title would be, like De O'Neill. They would surrender their holdings, but then they would become the Earls of Tyrone. That would be granted by Henry. So that actually happened. So that was the first time in pacifying the Irish. But for a while after that, because Henry, remember, in those days you had to raise an army. It's very expensive. Henry was always broke. He never had an army to enforce that. So even though in theory there was surrender and regrant, up to the Elizabethan time, the Irish lords really went on much as they always had. And they would have been the police force in the country.
And did the Normans, did they bring an education? Did they bring education to
Yeah, it was very important to them. Yeah, they came in as French speakers, but they would have, yes, they would have believed. In fact, quite a lot of them then would have sent their children abroad, actually, to France to be educated, even before, the Catholic colleges were there. So education was a huge thing for them, and they were a very cultured people. A lot of them would have spoken, most of them spoke French, and they would have spoke English as well. And then when they came to Ireland, they would have started learning Irish as well. But a lot of the systems that are here and the schools that are in the cities, a lot of these would have had found Norman foundation.
In terms of the story of Ireland, then, that you were telling over a number of episodes, where do we go to next then?
Yeah, well, what we were doing now is we're looking then. The Normans are there then, so they have come through, and where we're coming through to then, we're moving on now to Henry VIII and the Tudors, and at that stage, what had happened was with the Normans was that gradually over time, their power, the Inch writ only ran in the Pale, which is a very small area around the east coast, running from Dublin up as far as Dundalk. Now, outside of that, you might have had the butlers. They were always reasonably loyal to the crown, so the English would kind of ran there. But outside of that, then nothing happened. And one part of Ireland then hadn't been conquered at all. That was because the powerful O'Neills, that was the one place the Normans didn't conquer, West Ulster, where the O'Neills were there. So that area still remained Gaelic. And in fact, that was always then the most Gaelic part of Ireland. But in the end, what happened really was nobody worried about Ireland until the religious wars began. And then Spain was Catholic, England was Protestant. Spain and the Pope wanted to bring England back into Catholicism, and one way to do that would be to invade England. And one handy way of doing that would be you had a Catholic population who would support you in Ireland, so you could actually invade Ireland. And suddenly the English crown became really worried about the idea of an invasion, which they were right about. They did try it, of an invasion of Ireland. Suddenly they say, we have to put smock on all these fellas, we have to control these countries. And even though it nearly broke her, and nearly broke the English crown, they raised armies, they fought big long wars in Ireland, which culminated with the 7 Years' War and the defeat at Kinsale then of the Spanish at Kinsale and the Irish at Kinsale, and that was the end then of the Gaelic way of Ireland. And from then on, Ireland was always anglicised.
So when we refer to this famous or infamous 800 years of oppression, this is what we're talking. This is the genesis of that.
Well, this is the genesis. The genesis would be the Normans. Now, the English came in, probably a bit simplified. I'd say Henry would see himself as French, and the knights who initially came in, like Sprongo, they were actually Welsh. They came in from Wales. So, as I say, history is always very, very confusing. But that's what I remember being at a match one time, and the English referee wasn't given things to Ireland. He wasn't given enough to Ireland. The fella shouted in, something like this: 700 years of oppression, and now this. He'd given a penalty against Ireland or something. The fella said, no, 800 years of oppression. So, there you are.
It's great. Be sad news, John G, this week with the passing of Niamh Kinnane of Upperchurch. Very much a central figure in that community in Upperchurch.
Well, absolutely. I mean, a light has gone out in all our lives, and of course. Myself and Alison, we were up there. We shared the hospitality, and you'll have a cup of tea and all
tour,
that.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, but there was a huge hospitality there as well. But I mean, she was behind all of that. She was a very, very intelligent human being, and she got so many things done for Upperchurch. I mean, herself and Connie Ryan, and we met Connie as well up there. They transformed the community, and they made it a model for a long time of how communities should develop. And of course, the community has gone ahead, and its population is now increasing.
Did you tell me she was involved with Mockra as well?
Yeah, that's the thing about Niamh. That's when I met her first. I was in Mockra as well. But she was one of the big stars of Mockra then. She was the secretary of the county executive, and my God, was she known for her efficiency. Everything, she knew everybody. Everything was in its place. She was highly innovative, but she always credits the fact that that Mockra was her university. She didn't go to third level. Mockra was her university. She learned, and I must agree, the training within Mockra was absolutely fantastic. And then she brought that when she was and she was a huge change agent within the community.
Well, she spoke to Ali and yourself during the very first village tour to Upperchurch in 2024. She was reflecting on her father's influence on her life. Let's hear a little of that conversation.
Well, I suppose I was only 3 when he died, so I have very little, very vague memory of him. But I have to say, our mother was a wonderful woman, and there was never a day that his name wasn't mentioned. So I was actually, I'd say, in my 20s before I realised what we lost.
Yeah.
Because he was very much part of our lives, and she always wanted us to know our relations. She wanted to know his friends. She wanted to promote Upperchurch. She inspired all that in us, really. So I've only one sister and a nephew. My late brother-in-law passed away there a year ago, Jimmy Butler. So I suppose asking about Dad, I only know all the good things. Dad was very involved in everything, and at the 50th anniversary of his election to the Dáil, the people of the parish put up a plaque outside the door, and it was a great day here. Huge crowds turned up to it.
You must have been so proud that day, were you?
I was more sorry that my mother wasn't alive.
I know.
She was just dead 3 years at the time, so I would have liked to have her been there. She would have been very proud.
Yeah, I know, she would have. Now, like this, the saying goes, a black cat is black kittens, and you've always been involved in committees here as well. You've been at the heart of everything that's kind of been developed here as well. Upperchurch is very unique in that. I mean, the level of community involvement, isn't it?
Yes, well, when we left school, and I was obviously, it was, and the cards that I'd be coming back to here, we joined a wonderful organisation, Mockra at the time, and not many people were going to college like today, and it was a fantastic organisation to get a voice for younger people to talk. So I suppose I thought I could, at that age, that we could solve the world's problems. It took me almost 50 years to realise it doesn't happen as fast as that. But anyhow, I got involved in Mockra, totally involved at North Tip and county level, and then I got involved in the local development, which has been a wonderful organisation for this parish. And development became an umbrella group for all the smaller organisations, the Historical Society, the Housing for the Elderly, the active retired, everything kind of came, so here we are today now, and we think we're very upmarket. So from humble beginnings, and of course, so for all that, that spirit that came out of all that, that's still as alive today, even if it's in a different way. But and Hill people have always had to rely on each other, because we're proud to be Hill people, but we've supported each other, and we have in our development, our logo is Scoa Céile of Arnadina, under the shadow of our people we live.
The late Niamh Kinnane there, speaking to Ali during one of the episodes of the village tour. It's interesting there, and may she rest in peace indeed. Interesting when Niamh was speaking about Hill people. I love that, and I love the fact that they're different.
Yeah. You see, what I always think is also island people as well as that. I always think that because it's a tougher life up there, people come closer together. You can't be an island. You know the way if you live in Foxrock in Dublin and you have a lovely house, you can go in and out to work and socialise in the golf club and socialise with your work colleagues and hardly know your next door neighbour. You don't go out. But if you live on an island or up in the hills, you're going to be snowed in someday and you're going to need a neighbour to pull you out with a tractor. That generally doesn't happen in Foxrock. So that's the sort of thing she's talking about, and this belief in knowing everybody, and there's nowhere stronger than that. And of course then, that Kinnane's wasn't the pub, it was kind of the hub of parish life. Everything went in there, people came together, and of course in itself it was a beautiful pub as well. And she didn't mention a lot of the things she did. I mean, they had a hugely successful walking festival that brought people from all over Ireland, and very early on one of their innovations was they set up an IT centre in Upperchurch, and they trained so many rural communities in how to use IT when people didn't know anything about it. So Upperchurch was the place. And then of course her brother, her sister Siobhan, Kinnane's became famous and still is famous for the quality of its food as well. So it was, I always think in Upperchurch you found all the best of rural Ireland.
That's for sure. Well, Niamh will be sadly missed indeed, and our condolences to her family. You have a talk happening this coming Monday, I think.
Yes, I have, yes. I'm up in the Abbey Court at the kind invitation of the Ormond Historical Society, and I'll be talking about the whole pilgrim phenomenon, the history of pilgrimage, what I did when I wrote a book about it, and then the modern motivation, how people seek meaning by going back into a situation, in other words, where they step out of where there's 101, 4 or 5 balls to keep in the air, and suddenly they seem to desire that, this simplified situation where all you have to do is put one foot in front of the other. And like I'll be talking about my own time pilgrim walking, going out to Spain, and some of the very humorous things, not all of which reflected well on me. So I think it won't be too heavy on history. It will be lightweight as well. But for anyone who's thinking of walking pilgrimage, either here in Ireland or going out, there's a Celtic Camino now, we can walk part in Ireland, part in Spain. I'll be talking about all of that. Should be great night. 8 o'clock in the Abbey Court, thanks to the Ormond Historical Society. It would be great to see you there.
Excellent. A lot of compliments coming into you for your piece, or your various pieces indeed, on the history of Ireland. We're all harking back to remembering bits and pieces of this from our school days, John, but we didn't get the full story.
No, you didn't, because the thing is that, history is used as well as that for nation building. When we get to the Battle of the Boyne, for example, you'll say, oh yeah, well that was very simple. It was a Catholic v a Protestant king. Whose side was the Pope on? He was on the Protestant side. He was on the side of William. He gave thanks when William won because he was afraid that the son king, Henry, who was supporting James, Louis XIV, was going to invade the Papal States. So nothing is simple.
Yeah, they were pragmatic people, though, weren't they?
That's it. But then we tend to use, everything, going back to even Patrick Pearse, like he was some kind of a saint, short of canonization. But like all of those people, they made mistakes. They were full of insecurities. Beings, yeah. They were real human beings. But and in other circumstances, they'd never been heard again. History picked them up and thrust them into the limelight.
All right, well done indeed. Happy New Year, John, and thanks very much indeed. John G. O'Dwyer with us. News and information is coming up.
Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, Puckon. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.